As Julia said, I'm Ollie Hemmings and this is Pete Creech, and we formed the Heart of Argyll Wildlife Organisation back in 2016, basically at the end of the Scottish beaver trial, which we were both involved with the intention of continuing our very popular guided beaver walks and the education work that we did. And also expand into celebrating and encouraging people to find out and appreciate all the other fantastic wildlife that we have in the Argyll area. So we managed to open the Argyll Beaver Centre, Visitor Centre, for people to come and find out about where to go and what there was to see in the area. And up until this year, we've been doing very well and attracting more and more visitors each season that we've opened. And then, of course, suddenly COVID hit. And unfortunately, the week that we were supposed to be opening our visitor centre for the season, the lockdown happened and we couldn't open. So there's been lots of big changes for humans with the lockdown through the COVID pandemic. But we also started pondering recently about how our local wildlife and national wildlife has coped with the changes that have affected the humans. Because, of course, wildlife didn't wake up one morning and realise that it was in lockdown. It carried on life as usual and probably wondered why there was fewer humans around and maybe even enjoyed that. So we've started to think about how our human lockdown has affected our wildlife in the area. So I can find the right button to click to move my slides. There we go.
So I thought we'd start with humans. So here you can see humans in the natural environment, gregarious and shopping, which we used to do a lot of once upon a time. And the day after lockdown, the same scene. A lot of the emphasis has been on the impacts on our towns and cities, the economic impacts, social impacts. But there have been similar impacts in rural areas as well. So the next very similar set of slides show a nature reserve. Again, the first one has lots of people in and quite a few gulls, obviously looking for bread. The second photo has some ducks wandering around looking a bit bemused. There are lots of positive things that have happened for wildlife that we will talk about. But for some of those agencies and organisations that help us see wildlife, not all of the things have been positive. So some of our wildlife facilities, our nature reserves, have been put under as much economic pressure as some of our shops and businesses. So there are implications for both town and country as there are for the wildlife as well. So what happened? Well, we stopped moving around. We stopped moving around quite drastically. There's a few of these graphs, but briefly, the area to the left of the orange bar, which says stay at home, is what we were doing in January onwards in 2020. How much driving and walking, how much public transport we were using. And then on the 26th of March, and briefly before that, the whole lot fell off the side of the cliff. The indication of how little we moved around was the fact that fuel sales dropped by up to 70%. We did very little moving around at all, and we certainly didn't travel to other areas to see things. So visitors disappeared. We stayed at home. We stayed at home a lot. And as we slowly started to move out of lockdown and we were allowed to drive to other areas, then so things started to rise a little bit. So what effect did that stay at home have on our wildlife?
It was a very sudden change, obviously, for us, and it took a lot of getting used to, and some of us still haven't got used to it. But I think quite quickly, a lot of our wildlife nationally did get used to it. We started seeing reports in the news of some of the first sort of funny wildlife sightings, like these goats that were wandering around the town in Wales. And luckily for us, when lockdown started in the spring, it was really nice weather. And so people started doing what they could to get outside, and gardening became the big thing. So people with time on their hands and being stuck at home and not getting out and about much started signing up for citizen science things like garden bird watching surveys and that sort of thing, which was great for wildlife because it was becoming far less timid because there were fewer people around. It didn't just affect our towns and cities, but our countryside too, and the marine environment as well. A lot of noise that we don't think about happens underwater in the oceans, from engines of big ships to sailing boats, big and small. So all of this background noise is interfering with our cetaceans' communications. And didn't you say that you read something about?
There was some research that one of the things that COVID did for the scientific community was give them an unprecedented opportunity to record what was going on. There was much dismay and distress because a lot of scientists saw an opportunity to record what was going on at the very point at which they weren't allowed to go out and record it. However, a lot of recording systems were already in place pre-COVID, and this is where a lot of this data has come from. So as Ollie was saying about cetaceans, research done worldwide, and I've listened to recordings from places like the Baltic Sea and from the Pacific West Coast of Canada. There's been a long-running study off Vancouver. There, lockdown arrived just at the point as the cruising season started. So these massive cruise ships were all just stuck in dock. We see a large ship go by and we don't really think of it as a noisy thing. You might hear the engines thrumming away from a distance, but it doesn't sound anything like a jet aircraft. But in terms of decibel rating, something like a supertanker or a container ship or a cruise ship creates as much noise as a jet airliner taking off. That's incredible because it makes that noise 24 hours a day, not just when it's pulling out of port. All the time that it's under load and running, that's the amount of noise it's creating. The scientists in Vancouver found that there are lots of whales there, like there are cetaceans of all sorts, like there are off the west coast of Scotland. They found that not only did the amount of whale song, as we call it, or whale conversation, as they tend to refer to it, increased, the complexity of that song increased. So these whales not only communicating more often, they were communicating, for want of a better word, more deeply with each other. The thing that sprang into my mind when I read this was that if you're in a disco or a nightclub, it's very difficult to have a complex and detailed conversation about anything. So you tend to
boil to the basics.
Yeah, boil things down to monosyllables in order to try and get simple messages across. We already know that noise puts cetaceans under extreme levels of stress. These are animals that communicate with their entire bodies. So you can only imagine what that routine amount of background noise has on them. We know that noise has an effect on humans, of course. That's why we have noise regulations. But we don't have those noise regulations in place for our wildlife. So the seas off mid-Argyll saw changes just as much as the land-based animals as well. And I think something else that we've realised with the environmental crisis that we are experiencing is that in some ways, rather like human populations, there are animal winners and losers. Those animals that can adapt, maybe those animals that are already very adaptable, may well thrive as conditions change. Others, due to all sorts of reasons, everything from geographical range to their food choices, may not be so lucky. So, however, this lockdown gave us a chance to study what was going on in a little bit more detail.
So we've looked at the changes, the impacts that animals and wildlife faced nationally or even worldwide, if you think about the oceans, coming a bit closer to home. Anecdotally, even in a rural area, we noticed a big difference. We noticed in our village of Ford, where Pete and I are neighbours, where we live, just the presence of creatures that would normally be much more shy of humans were being seen more regularly, such as our squirrels and our pine martens that were coming down to feed us and being seen in and around gardens because there just wasn't the human disturbance. So, speaking of red squirrels, particularly, the human interest in recording species during lockdown grew, which is a great thing for citizen science, really encouraging the general public to start recording and building these big databases of what we see. And we can build up data that can tell us trends in what's going on over periods of time. So it's been a really good thing that people have been engaged in recording what they've seen.
So, yeah, I'm always told I have a bit of a fondness for graphs.
Yeah.
This was taken from the website of Saving, which you may know of. A kind of conglomeration of organisations have been trying to ensure that the impacts upon our red squirrels in Scotland are minimised. Much of it due to disease transference due to greys, but other impacts as well. So what happened 8 years ago, in brief, was that areas of zero tolerance were drawn around Scotland, where it was decided that grey squirrels would not be allowed to make any further incursions. And on the back of that, a very large citizen science project started, using lots of volunteers and the public to record your sightings. It's one of the simplest websites to use if you want to contribute to this. All it really asks you are, was the squirrel that you saw red or grey? Was it dead or alive? How many of them did you see? And where and when did you see them? That's it. You can then look at an interactive map and your recording will crop up a couple of days later. But just before we go to that map, I'd like you to look at this 2020. We haven't finished yet, and it's already got to the top of the graph. They're going to need a bigger graph before we finish the year. So both sightings of greys and phenomenally so of reds is maybe sadly not a reflection of a huge increase in red squirrels. It might be due to breeding success, because I think a lot of animals had a very good spring. But I also think it's due to people's increased awareness and the amount of time they would have spent outside and looking at things, and how they became more engaged in nature, and as a result of that became more enthused in trying to look after some of our iconic species. So if we go to the map, wow. So brilliantly simple map again. You can see where red squirrels are being seen. You can see the areas where they tend to not be around in some of the higher mountainous areas and on some of our islands, or most of our islands, in fact. And you can also see where the grey squirrels have made these incursions through the central belt, and in Dumfries and Galloway, where they had an outbreak of pox this year, which wasn't so great. But as a positive, it looks like the greys are under siege now in Aberdeen. And for the first year, red squirrels have been seen back in Aberdeen town centre in some of the more sort of wooded parks and things, which is great. For some reason or other, greys were released in Aberdeen in the 1970s. For what purpose, who knows? But there are positives and negatives being seen here. And one of the great positives is that Saving Scotland's red squirrels have received an awful lot of data, which they can now use for future years.
So obviously this is only one example of species that we've been recording during our enforced lockdown period. Garden birds was another really popular one. Many people for a number of years now have taken part in the Great Garden Bird Watch, which is 1 hour over a weekend once a year. People have also started, because of lockdown, recording their sightings much more regularly than that. It's been lovely to hear the sort of aftermath, the anecdotal evidence that's coming out of all of this after lockdown. When we did manage to reopen the centre later this summer, the visitors that we've had in have been much more attuned to what they're looking at, or looking for things and learning about them, rather than just looking out of our window at the bird feeder and thinking, oh, there's lots of birds there, isn't it lovely? They've been asking more questions about, is that a such and such? Is that a chaffinch? Is that a great tit? which one is that? People are paying more attention. We also have a whiteboard in our centre where seasonally we write down species that are sighted in and around our centre. And the back end of this summer, when we've been open again, we've had more people contributing to that than we've ever had before, which is lovely. So I think it's created a greater interest in our environment because of our enforced lockdown. We've had some quirky results, though, like Pete showed you with the red squirrels. The big graph, the big bar at the end of the graph didn't necessarily show an increase in number of species, but it's an increase in recording. And there's a similar graph for our bird species. So during lockdown, or before lockdown, we had records of which one's which is
green is the
yes, avocet and marsh harrier and birds that are typically seen on nature reserves is the black line. So there were more records being submitted for birds which would be seen maybe on nature reserves rather than in your garden. You're very, very lucky if you get a marsh harrier in your garden. And the green line is garden bird species. So you can see this big crossover period, this big cross in the graph here, and then the period of lockdown. There was a massive reversal in the number of records that were being received about birds, mainly because we weren't able to get out and about to visit nature reserves. So that's the reason for that black line sinking so much. And then obviously the pickup in the green line was because people were developing an interest in watching birds and then recording them as well.
So this graph kind of ties into that headline we saw at the beginning about the number of people signing up for a citizen science project, which is an ongoing project run by British Trust for Ornithology, where you record the number of birds that you see in your garden on a weekly basis. So it's big garden bird watch, if you like, times 52. But the principle is the same. You know, you're recording the maximum number of birds that you see in your garden in any 1 week. And again, if it's the sort of thing that you enjoy doing, you build up your own personal picture over time, which is great, because as soon as you start recording, BTO starts giving you personal breakdowns of what you're seeing and the proportions and all the rest of it. So it's kind of ongoing and it's interesting. It might be a cause of concern, I suppose, because if we had that 2 or 3 month period when we couldn't record what was going on in our nature reserves, then maybe we didn't know what was going on if things weren't great. But some of the anecdotal evidence that's coming out, again, back down to the decrease in disturbance. You can take disturbance to mean anything. It can mean humans walking around. It can be people taking their dog for a walk. It can be people taking their river cruiser down a river. All of these things constitute disturbance. And disturbance has its maximum effect when animals are most vulnerable in many ways of when they're breeding. The fact that they had a 3-month holiday from us seems to have had some quite spectacular results in some ways. The fear, I suppose, is whether, as we return to what we describe as normal, whether the animals can adjust quickly enough again. So I suppose the increase in road traffic might be a negative thing. So animals that for a couple of months got used to our roads being very quiet then have to readjust to the fact that suddenly our roads aren't quiet again. So those dynamics changed. But we are trying to concentrate a little bit more on the positives at the moment. And as Ollie was saying, that interest we saw literally with people coming in with their children saying that, you know, my child has started recording how many different types of birds that she can see or how many different types of mammals he can see. Never interested in that sort of thing before, but suddenly it's spawned that interest. And according to the recent research that I've seen from nature.scot, that has carried over post-lockdown. I know we're all back in a kind of lockdown again, but in that brief period when things seemed to be a bit more normal, more people were still going out, more people were still trying to engage with wildlife, and more people were trying to see more things and learn about them. So, as we said, people seem to be becoming more engaged. So what else happened? London's air probably isn't a very good similarly for what's going on in Argyll, but all things are relative. Anything that reduced the number of vehicles, the amount of industry, the amount of emissions in general is relative. So obviously we saw the greatest effects in our big cities. We must have all have seen those photos where people woke up in places like Paris or Bombay or Delhi or wherever, and suddenly they could see mountains. Suddenly they had clear air. Suddenly people who lived in cities that routinely broke World Health Organization limits on smog and the various pollutants, and that includes London, were breathing clean air. When you look at the statistics, the COVID statistics are pretty horrifying, but 50,000 people a year in Britain die as a direct result of pollution related respiratory diseases. So some people were given a breath of fresh air, at least for a little while. And again, of course, all of that has implications for our wildlife as well. So, and this is one of them. On the left here, we have some lungwort. I stuck lungwort in because there's loads and loads of it in Argyll. Wherever we go, we see lungwort. It's wonderful stuff. It's got a really interesting kind of life history. It changes colour. There's all sorts of wonderful stories about it, and a Swiss company still uses it in their cough mixtures. So it's still being used for its original, if you like, medieval purpose. I read something the other day talking about the rescue of lungwort from a tree in the Lake District, because it is so rare there. Attempts were being made to, as it were, rehome it. I'm not quite sure whether the oak tree was dying or there was some other problem. Which is something, incidentally, that the Swiss company that's making the cough mixture is also trying to do in order to sustainably harvest lungwort for their mixtures. But I saw a couple of comments on the Facebook pages for Argyll Biological Records and Argyll Nature talking about, we've just got that everywhere here. We've got that everywhere here, even when we're not in lockdown, even when we don't have, even when we do have whatever the normal level of pollutants is in the air in Argyll, which is precious little. This stuff is so sensitive, and we have it, and 200 plus other species in an average glen in Knapdale Forest or the Atlantic Oak Woodland, all of which are clean air indicators. So I don't suppose the lungwort noticed a huge difference here, and I don't suppose it had a huge difference in areas where there wasn't lichens because they don't react that quickly. So, but nevertheless, it's still an example of what we have.
So human disturbance can constitute a number of things, or like Pete described earlier, air pollution being one, noise we've looked at, or we've mentioned in our coastal waters. This is a graph that's measured noise in a geological survey. So I didn't realise that noise can be measured by ground vibrations, if you like, but we found this quite interesting, that obviously the green dots on the left-hand side were measurements taken before lockdown, and
No. Sorry.
Go on.
No, sorry.
A different location.
The map shows where these seismic indicators are. So it's another example of these things that were already in place before we started. So the British Geological Survey routinely monitors noise, and presumably things like minor earthquakes as well. Mm-hmm. So the locations show the green ones are where it became quieter during lockdown, and the blue ones are where it became noisier. The one that intrigues us is there's a green dot which looks to be roughly around Oban, and I'm wondering what was making so much noise in Oban prior to lockdown as opposed to afterwards. But it's just another indicator of what we get used to. Humans are affected both positively and negatively by noise. There are times when we want things to be quiet, and there are times when we thrive off maybe the buzz, maybe a busy city of an evening. People enjoy that, but they maybe don't quite enjoy the same amount of noise at 5 o'clock in the morning when they're trying to get to sleep. So it depends how attuned you are to these things. People talked about hearing birdsong it was louder. And no, it wasn't. It's just that we could hear it.
Everything else was quieter.
Yeah, and there's also some evidence to show the birds toned it down a bit. We're not the only species that shout. If birds can't be heard, they sing louder. There's quite a lot of evidence to show this. If those animals don't need to, then why waste the energy trying to create more noise? So even but we were hearing it better. So again, lots and lots of people talking about how amazing the dawn chorus was in early May when everything else was so much quieter, even here.
And that's the same for lots of cetaceans, and of course we've had, I don't know whether it is just anecdotal, I haven't actually looked up recordings comparative to previous periods of time to now, but there do seem to be an awful lot more cetaceans, anecdotally, being spotted locally around our waters. And that's another species that has enjoyed a period of quiet in the water where they haven't had to shout at each other. So where we've seen on websites such as iRecord, which is one of the major recording, or iSpot as well, one of the major recording websites that everybody, general public, can use. If you don't know iSpot and iRecord, I would highly recommend that you go and look them up. I love their definition of what they record is all known life forms. So plants, animals, fungi, everything and anything in between, whatever that might be. And it's a fantastic resource for beginners as well. So we encourage classes of school children that we go and teach to put up photographs of whatever they've found on iSpot. And there's a panel of experts who will look at your photograph that you've put up, and it asks you a series of questions, so you can put in as much detail as you can as to what you think you have found, and then you will get a response to say, yes, you're correct, or this is what I think it is. And you can then transfer that over onto iRecord, which eventually feeds into the National Biodiversity Network, which is another one of those big maps like the red squirrel maps, except it covers all species. So that's another really good, you can get lost in that website forever. It does take a long time to load because there's so much information on that database. But of course, you can also feed into that database by your local recording group as well. So for us, we've got Argyll Biological Records, we've got Argyll Nature, we've got ourselves, Heart of Argyll Wildlife. There's lots of different groups that on social media and through our website will take your sightings and your records, and we can pass those on to the bodies and organisations that can use this information.
And of course, we have Argyll Bird Club as well.
Sorry,
that routinely record everything that's there.
Absolutely.
And even then, in places like Loch Gilphead, you'll find members of Argyll Bird Club staking out the front green every day.
Yeah.
And some of the species that we've seen being recorded in Loch Gilp is just incredible. So
we have great resources right on our doorstep.
We do. I mean, Jim Dixon from Argyll Bird Club was saying the other day, over 100 species of bird have been identified over Loch Gilp during a year. If it was anywhere else in the UK, it would at least be a local nature reserve. The fact that it doesn't have any designated protection here is astounding, to be honest. And why we don't make more of that? A lot of people just drive straight through Loch Gilphead. I doubt they're driving past one of the great bird sighting areas in the west of Scotland, and they can just stand on the front green in order to see them. So wonderful photos of kingfishers we've been seeing on the old quay outside the Esso petrol station. We've got little egrets down there. We've got all hooper swans coming in at the moment to rest over and feed. There's a constant, and over the winter, of course, especially if you get a storm or something, all sorts of blow-ins arrive there to take a rest and again to feed up on the mudflats. So intriguing place.
So iRecord, the website that I was just mentioning there, has put up some stats for us of the records that it was getting since lockdown began. So what were people getting out and about seeing more of? So lots of what we are lucky enough to call common species living in Argyll, but they're new things to an awful lot of people that are gaining an interest. Of course, during lockdown, we weren't driving many places, but we were encouraged to go out and about and take daily exercise. So for the majority of people, that was going for a walk. We're so lucky to live where we do. We could be all stuck in high-rise flats in the middle of the city, but luckily where we are, there's lots of places where we can safely go for a walk. Of course, lockdown for us and non-essential working, or non-essential working not happening, also meant that our verges didn't get cut as well. So locally to us, this is the road verge in Ford in our village, and the picture on the right there is the Crinan Canal. We have been working alongside Crinan Canal and Scottish Waterways for the last couple of years to maintain sort of no mow areas or refresh their strimming policy, which has been a fantastic boost for the local flora and a knock-on effect onto the local fauna as well. But of course, during lockdown, we had the opportunity to go out and appreciate this much more. So lots of people were out and about spotting things and recording things along the canal, and roads were safer to walk along as well. Pete and I actually started running. We were training for an ultra marathon during lockdown, and for the first time ever, and probably the only time ever, I ran down the Ford Road, or we both did, and turned right and ran up the main road to Oban. I would never dream of doing that now, but it was just an amazing opportunity to do something out of the ordinary. And for many people, something out of the ordinary is just going for a walk along a road that you wouldn't normally get to do because they're too busy with traffic. And we really appreciated the area in all its spring glory and then on into summer, because the road verges weren't being trimmed. So we had all this abundance of fantastic, diverse range of flowers that grew up. Lots of things to be seen, wonderful butterflies. It was a great spring and summer, so lots of insects and butterflies and things came out. Because of the lack of disturbance from humans, again, lots of things had a fantastic breeding season. Obviously, nobody wished for COVID and lockdown to happen, but as it did happen, lockdown couldn't have happened at a better time for the benefit to wildlife, for an undisturbed breeding season. So lots of baby animals out and about.
So, yep, quite like this one. This is a freshly minted great tit youngster, slightly soggy at the edges, but yeah, the pastel colours of things like blue tits and great tits are quite stunning. We've always had squirrels infrequently come to the centre, but we've never had this. So this is about a metre and a half away from a clear perspex window, and we had the experience this year of 3, I assume, related baby squirrels. I've got so many photos of this trio now, I don't know what to do with them. But I love this one because it looks like the one on the left is telling the one at the back a dirty joke. It looks absolutely horrified at whatever it said to it. The trio are still there, we think. We still have 3 now adult squirrels coming to our feeders. They are still much, much tamer than any of the squirrels we've seen in the past. They now hate each other, but they still don't seem to be too bothered by humans. So there are frequent although we've got 4 or 5 different feeders, of course they always want to go for the same thing. And at the moment they get the additional treat every now and again of a hazelnut in the shell, and that's
when we can afford it.
Yeah, when we can afford it. When they grab one of those, they immediately run off into the woodlands to bury it somewhere. Peanuts they'll eat on the spot, but hazelnuts are special.
Yeah. But we think that's one of the interesting things that's happened from lockdown is animals have become less timid, and animals that have been born this season are braver. Now, that's great for us because we get the opportunity like this to see them, and people walking down from the car park to the visitor centre are not disturbing these animals. They're not running away. But then that can have knock-on bad effects for the wildlife, unfortunately, as well. now that things are starting to get a bit more back to normal, there's a bit more traffic on the road. Any animals that have been born this season that are dispersing from their families are probably more likely to get run over. So, I mean, locally recently we've had an otter casualty down near Tiviallig. There's badgers usually start moving out from the family in late summer, the ones that were born last year. So we obviously see those as road traffic accidents, that sort of thing. Lots of deer get hit on the road.
So what happened when lockdown started was that obviously our operation closed down. And after a few days of stunned incomprehension, we decided we needed to do something. So the first thing that happened was that my garden pond moved into my office. So we realised the only way of keeping our group together and keeping people informed was through social media. So our Facebook page was already our kind of virtual community. It now became more or less our only community for a while. So we tried to keep as much going on there as possible. And we grew the page quite considerably. And we also had more images coming in from members, new members particularly, and also existing members as well. And we tried to keep up as much as possible. And that seemed to work quite well. So during that small period when we could do nothing, that's all we did. Once non-essential work was allowed outside, we were allowed back out in the field to do our monitoring work. So we could then relay current images back to folk. So obviously, we have done 3 years of monitoring now on behalf of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland of the beavers. So we get an awful lot of beaver footage. That's now stopped, but we're maintaining that footage. And so you can see here, this is Owen, who lives on Loch Buick. Owen is a consummate engineer, has been here since the start of the beaver trial. This time of year is extremely busy for beavers because this is collecting of food, lodge maintenance, and here is Owen heading back to the loch with some raw materials. Quite whether he's going to make that part of his food cache or build something with it. Knowing Owen, he'll probably build something with it. But so once we could go out, but everybody else couldn't go out, we realised we couldn't do our regular beaver walk. So we decided to do a virtual one instead. So we put that together. It took an awful lot longer to do than a real one. So we had a 20-minute walk. And we've also here got a brief clip of that walk that folks saw as a live Facebook event. And we used some of those old sticks to put our tripod on for our camera. We've got some fantastic
So we spent, played again. We spent quite a long time playing catch-up. Oh, why can't I move next onto the next slide? Hang on, there it is. Okay. We spent quite a lot of time playing catch-up because some of our contract work is monitoring the beavers. And unfortunately, lockdown meant that we never got the last 6 beavers into Knapdale that we were expecting to get during the further reinforcement period that we've had in Knapdale to shore up the genetic diversity of our beavers. And the final survey was done very recently, and the results of which can be seen on the Scottish Beavers website. If you're interested in that, you can look at their website. We think we have about high 20s, early 30s in number of beavers in the area. And we've been busily trying to camera trap to try and keep an eye on who is where. But obviously we get lots of other footage on our camera trap, so it's nice to keep up to date with the other wildlife that's around. So we've got some badgers that are just behind our centre, and increasingly since we've been open, we've been coming into the centre and noticing that the area around the bird feeders has been ploughed up. And we wondered who the culprits could be. So we set up a camera trap, and lo and behold, it's our family of badgers that are snuffling around for all the dropped seed and peanuts. We've also been able to start again getting some of our other projects up and running. The next big thing for us is being part of a 5-year oyster reinforcement project in Loch Creech. Pete and I and Heart of Argyll Wildlife Organisation have the education contract for that. So it's a big citizen science project, and we're hoping to, or we already have, got involvement with 6 or 7 local primary schools who over 5 years will come down to Creech Marina, where we have these oysters in these kind of oyster high-rise oyster flats, basically, that are hanging off the end of the pontoons. And the kids will pull these up at regular intervals and measure and record the growth of these oysters. More of them are being put onto the seabed in bays near the marina to repopulate the area with our once very common native oyster, which is virtually extinct now. So that's a new and exciting project that we're now able to start getting up and running again.
So bringing you up to date, more or less, finally, the Scottish Tourism decided that we could all reopen on July the 15th. So, and I hasten to add, both of these photos were taken in 2019. So
not socially distanced.
Not socially distanced. However, we found that we could operate our beaver walks. So we went to a booking only and limited numbers, so we could keep that social distance. And we had some really good beaver sightings this year. On Cuivar, where there are now 2 families that don't like each other. And we also managed a couple of seashore safaris on the basis that a beach is quite a good place to socially distance. And again, the variety of wildlife we find down at Castle Bay and Tavialic, every single time we go there, we find something new. And we were just so grateful to be open, and we were also, even more than that, extremely grateful for the support we got from folk. The numbers of folk coming and queuing, because we only allowed one group in at a time, was really heartening. So our visitor numbers during that period, when there weren't any particular restrictions, when people could travel, were up on the previous year. I've put the bikes in there because we hope that one of the positive things that will come out of this is that we will have a greater appreciation of our natural environment. We will appreciate that we really do have to undergo a large-scale effort towards habitat restoration. That the environmental crisis that was headline news before we went into COVID didn't just go away, I'm afraid. It's still there. And we still need to deal with that as well as a pandemic. We hope there might be a future that will incorporate some of the best bits that we've learnt over this period, which might help us with the ongoing issues that will our environment, our habitats, and I suppose ultimately our future depend on.